Some people fight for a seat at the table. Others build their own. But what happens when someone dares to walk through a door that was never meant for them? Let us know in the comments below. Captain Natalya Harper adjusted the crisp collar of her uniform, the gleaming gold stripes on her sleeves a silent testament to the years of dedication she had poured into her career. She had spent over a decade in the cockpit, logging thousands of flight hours, making split-second decisions at 3,5,000 feet, and proving over and over again that she deserved to be where she was. But as she strode toward the towering glass building of SkyWest Atlantic's corporate headquarters, her presence alone seemed to disrupt the natural order of things. She felt the stares before she heard the voice. "Ma'am, can I help you?" The question was polite, but the tone was anything but. Natalya barely spared the receptionist a glance as she stepped up to the sleek marble counter. Claire Simmons. Young, blonde, and wearing the kind of pleasant but firm smile that had probably never wavered in the presence of the airline's senior male executives, tilted her head, her manicured fingers still poised over her keyboard. "I'm here for the leadership meeting," Natalya said, reaching into her bag for her company ID. Claire's smile didn't falter, but her gaze flickered over Natalya's uniform with the same hesitation people had when they weren't sure whether they were speaking to the janitor or the CEO. "I'm sorry, but this is an executive-level meeting. Are you sure you're in the right place?" Natalya didn't blink. "Positive?" She slid her ID across the counter, letting the laminated card speak for itself. Claire hesitated just a beat too long before picking it up. Natalya had seen this dance before. The quick scan of her name, the brief flicker of surprise, and then the inevitable attempt to regain control of the moment. It was subtle, sometimes nothing more than a shift in tone, a tightening of the lips, but she had learned to recognize it for what it was. She was never the person they expected. Claire cleared her throat. "Oh, Captain Harper." Natalya didn't bother acknowledging the sudden change in recognition. "I'll just need to—" "Is there a problem?" a deep voice cut in. Natalya turned her head just in time to see Derek Matthews step forward, his security badge gleaming under the bright lobby lights. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent years making snap judgments about people before they ever spoke a word. "No problem," Natalya answered before Claire could. "Just waiting for my ID to be checked." Derek studied her, then glanced at Claire. The pause between them was so slight that most people wouldn't have noticed it, but Natalya wasn't most people. "I'll handle this," Derek said. Claire handed him the ID, and Natalya watched as he inspected it, as if confirming her credentials required more scrutiny than the routine swipe Claire had given the last two men who had walked in before her. "You a pilot?" Derek asked, flipping the card between his fingers. Natalya exhaled slowly through her nose. "Yes," she said. His brow furrowed. "A captain?" She stared at him, willing him to understand the weight of his own question. "What does it say on the ID?" she asked evenly. He didn't answer. She reached for the badge, but Derek didn't hand it back immediately. Instead, he gave her one last assessing look before finally placing it on the counter. "Meeting's on the 26th floor, Claire said, her voice lighter now, as if they hadn't just wasted several minutes proving something that should have never been in question. Natalya retrieved her ID and walked toward the elevator, her spine straight, her pace unhurried. She had spent years climbing the ranks in an industry that had never been built for people like her. She had heard the whispers, the assumptions, the casual dismissals disguised as professionalism. She had flown through storms, navigated emergency landings, and trained pilots who would one day sit in the same boardrooms she was being stopped from entering. And yet, a uniform wasn't always enough. As the elevator doors closed around her, she pressed the button for the 26th floor, her jaw tightening. There was always another battle waiting. And this time, she wasn't walking away. The elevator hummed as it ascended, a quiet, mechanical whisper that filled the space around Natalya. She adjusted her cuffs, feeling the weight of the encounter downstairs settle somewhere deep in her chest. It wasn't new, and yet every time it happened, it burrowed into her bones like an old injury that never quite healed. The door slid open, revealing the executive floor. Pristine, polished, and far too quiet for an industry that thrived on constant motion. She stepped into the corridor, her heels clicking against the sleek tile, eyes scanning the space. A few men in navy blue pilot uniforms stood near the conference room entrance, engaged in casual conversation. Not one of them looked surprised to be here. Not one of them was questioned at the door. One of them, Logan Pierce, caught her eye. A senior captain with 20 years in the industry, his silver hair neatly combed back, posture as rigid as ever. He didn't nod in greeting, didn't acknowledge her at all. Instead, he turned slightly, angling his body toward his conversation partner, as if that alone would erase her presence. She was used to this, too. Natalya exhaled slowly and pushed forward, reaching for the conference room door. "Captain Harper." The voice stopped her hand mid-air. Richard Coleman stood just a few feet away, his tailored suit crisp, his tie perfectly knotted. SkyWest Atlantic CEO had the kind of practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes, a politician's expression wrapped in corporate charm. She let her hand fall to her side. "Mr. Coleman," she greeted, her voice steady. "Didn't expect to see you here." That made her pause. He knew she was a senior captain. He knew she had every right to be in this room. But here he was, framing her presence as an anomaly. "I was invited," she said. He smiled again, that same rehearsed expression, and gestured toward the door. "Of course. Please, after you." She held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was long and modern, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. A polished oak conference table stretched through the center, surrounded by high-backed chairs already half-filled with executives and senior staff. She spotted Jada Morgan near the far end of the room, the only other black woman in the space, her dark curls pulled into a sleek bun. Jada caught her eye and tilted her head slightly in question, already sensing something had happened before Natalya even had the chance to sit down. She made her way to an open chair near Jada, ignoring the brief flicker of hesitation from the man seated beside her. Richard Coleman took his place at the head of the table, clearing his throat as he straightened his papers. The murmurs around the room quieted. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "As you know, this meeting is about the future of SkyWest Atlantic. We're in a critical period. Public trust is everything, and we need to ensure that we're not only operating efficiently, but leading the industry in a way that reflects our values." The words were smooth, corporate polished, designed to sound meaningful without committing to anything. Natalya kept her expression unreadable. For years, she had watched decisions get made in rooms like this, decisions about hiring practices, promotion tracks, training programs, decisions that often favored the same people who had never once been stopped at the front desk. Jada tapped a pen lightly against her notepad. "Before we move forward, I'd like to address something." All eyes turned toward her. Richard arched an eyebrow. "Go ahead, Captain Morgan." Jada's expression remained neutral. "It's been brought to my attention that there are concerns regarding accessibility within corporate spaces for senior staff." The air in the room changed. It was subtle, but there. A slight shift in posture, the quiet clearing of throats. Natalya remained still. Richard's smile didn't waver. "Could you clarify what you mean?" Jada nodded. "Of course. I'm referring to the fact that certain employees, fully qualified senior pilots, are being questioned when trying to enter the building." A pause. Then Logan Pierce let out a quiet chuckle. "I think we all know what this is about." Natalya turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't even look surprised. "Do we?" she asked. Logan leaned back in his chair. "We're all professionals here. No one's saying anything was intentional, but come on. Are we really going to waste time on this? Security has protocols. Mistakes happen. Mistakes. That was what they always called it. Jada set her pen down. It wasn't a mistake. Logan scoffed. Oh, so now you're saying it was deliberate? She didn't answer. Because she didn't have to. Everyone in that room knew the truth. Richard adjusted his tie, exhaling through his nose. Look, let's not get sidetracked. If there's an issue with how security handles entry, we can discuss it with HR separately, but right now, we need to focus on the company's future. Natalya finally spoke. That's exactly what we're talking about. Silence. She let her words settle, the weight of them pressing against the tension in the air. The company's future, she continued, depends on whether or not you acknowledge the flaws in its foundation. We can sit here and talk about public trust, leadership, and company values all day, but if the people who are supposed to represent this airline aren't treated with respect the moment they walk through the door, then what exactly are we leading? Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. Captain Harper, I appreciate your perspective, but I don't think... With all due respect, Mr. Coleman, I don't think you're in a position to dismiss this. The temperature in the room dropped. Natalya folded her hands in front of her. You need pilots. You need people who represent what this industry is supposed to stand for. But if you want to talk about the future, then let's talk about who's actually included in that vision. No one spoke. Jada glanced at her, a flicker of something like approval in her expression. Finally, Richard exhaled. All right. His voice was careful now, measured. I hear you, he said. I'll make sure HR takes a look at the protocols. It was a non-answer, wrapped in corporate diplomacy. Natalya didn't nod, didn't thank him, because she knew how these meetings worked. Nothing changed unless you forced it to. And she wasn't finished yet. Natalya sat at the long table, her hands resting on the cool surface. The air in the conference room was thick with unspoken words, but the conversation had moved on. That was how it always worked. Let the moment pass, let the tension settle, then steer everything back to business as usual. She watched as Richard Coleman flipped to the next page in his folder, pretending like the last few minutes had never happened. Around the room, the other captains and executives followed his lead. The incident at the entrance, the underlying bias, the quiet refusal to acknowledge what had just been exposed. It was all being smoothed over, like a minor turbulence they could ignore. Natalya wasn't ignoring it. Her pulse drummed steadily in her ears, but her expression remained neutral. Years in the cockpit had trained her well. Never let them see when you're shaken. Never give them an excuse to call you emotional, irrational, or difficult. She glanced at Jada, who caught her eye for just a second before refocusing on the meeting. They both knew what had just happened, but now wasn't the time. Not yet. Richard was droning on about quarterly projections, fleet expansion, and cost-cutting strategies. The usual. Then, a single sentence cut through the monotony. We'll also be reviewing our promotion criteria for senior captains. Natalya stiffened. Her fingers curled slightly against the table's surface, her body tense with the kind of quiet alarm that only came from recognizing a threat disguised as policy. Logan Pierce leaned forward, flipping a page in his own folder, nodding along as if he already knew what was coming. Richard continued, voice smooth. Given the airline's financial restructuring, we'll be reassessing leadership tracks. We need to ensure that promotions are based on more than just flight hours. We need to consider a broader evaluation of leadership ability and long-term commitment to the company. There it was. It was subtle, but she had been in this industry long enough to recognize a well-placed obstacle when she saw one. Flight hours had always been the defining metric for promotions. You put in the time, you earned the rank. It was simple, objective. But broader evaluation was a loaded phrase. It gave the company the power to decide who was leadership material and who wasn't. It was a tool designed to keep certain people in place, certain people like her. Natalya forced her voice to stay level. And how will this evaluation be conducted? Richard looked up, meeting her gaze with that same unreadable expression. It'll be a holistic process, peer feedback, managerial assessments, and a leadership review board. Leadership review board. A board that conveniently was filled with the same faces that had been sitting at this table for years. Logan Pierce smirked slightly, tapping his pen against the table. We have to make sure we're setting the right example for the next generation of pilots. She knew exactly what he meant. Natalya leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. So, let me get this straight, she said slowly. You're saying that after years of using flight hours as the primary metric, now, just as certain pilots are reaching the threshold for captain upgrades, the criteria is changing? A few of the men at the table shifted in their seats. Richard sighed. Captain Harper, this isn't about singling anyone out. It's about ensuring we have the best people leading this airline. The best people. Another loaded phrase. Natalya tilted her head slightly. And you're suggesting that the pilots who have already been promoted under the old system weren't the best people? A pause. Richard smiled thinly. I think you're reading too much into this. She wasn't. She was reading exactly what was in front of her. For years she had followed every rule, met every requirement, exceeded every expectation, and just when she was on the cusp of stepping into the next level, they were moving the finish line. She heard Jada shift beside her. A slow inhale, a restrained reaction. They weren't going to make a scene here. Not yet. Richard checked his watch. Let's move on, he said. We have a lot to cover. And just like that it was done. No discussion, no debate. Just a quiet, unspoken decision that would keep the people in power exactly where they wanted to be. Natalya clenched her jaw, forcing herself to breathe through the frustration. It wasn't over. It was never over. An hour later, the meeting wrapped up. Chairs scraped against the floor as people stood, stretching, shaking hands, making casual conversation as if nothing of significance had just transpired. Natalya gathered her things, her movements precise, controlled. She wasn't going to rush. Wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing any sign that they had rattled her. Jada placed a hand lightly on her arm. You good? She asked under her breath. Natalya nodded once. Yeah, but they both knew she wasn't. As they stepped out of the conference room, Logan Pierce's voice drifted toward them. Can't make it too easy, he was saying to another captain, his voice laced with amusement. Gotta keep the standards up. Jada exhaled sharply through her nose, but Natalya didn't turn around. She kept walking. Because if she stopped, if she looked him in the eye, she didn't trust herself not to say something that would burn the whole damn room down. They reached the elevators, the doors slid open, and they stepped inside. The moment the doors shut, Jada spoke. This is bullshit. Natalya let out a short laugh, humorless. You think? Jada shook her head, pressing the button for the lobby. They're trying to make sure we don't get promoted. That's what this is. Natalya nodded, but her mind was already moving past that. Because she wasn't just thinking about herself. She was thinking about every young black pilot who was coming up in this industry, every woman who had to fight to be taken seriously, every person who had been told they had to work twice as hard just to be considered. She had spent years accepting the silent rules of this industry. But now, standing in that elevator, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to accept them anymore. The elevator doors slid open, and Natalya stepped into the lobby, her posture controlled, her face unreadable. But inside, something was shifting. No, cracking. She had spent years keeping her head down, biting her tongue, proving herself in an industry that had never made space for her. Today was supposed to be another reminder of that, another lesson in how the rules weren't written for people like her. Except she wasn't going to take it this time. She walked past the front desk without sparing a glance at Claire or the security guard who had questioned her presence earlier. She didn't care about their quiet stares or the way their eyes followed her exit. She had bigger things to handle now. Outside, Jada caught up to her, stepping in sync as they walked toward the parking garage. "What's the plan?" Jada asked. Natalya exhaled slowly. "We're not letting this slide." Jada smirked. "Good. Because I was not in the mood to sit back and let them rewrite the rules just to keep us out." They reached their cars, but neither of them moved to get in. Natalya turned to face her friend, her mind already racing. "We go public." Jada raised an eyebrow. "Public?" Natalya nodded. "They want to do this quietly, in boardrooms, behind closed doors, slipping policy changes under the radar so nobody notices. We don't give them that luxury. We make sure everyone sees what's happening." Jada considered her for a second, then grinned. "I hope you know that means war." Natalya smiled back. "It's about time." By the time she got home, her fingers were already flying over her phone. She pulled up the message thread with Thomas Reynolds, an investigative journalist she had met years ago after an aviation panel. He had a reputation for uncovering systemic issues in the industry, safety violations, discrimination, the things airlines liked to pretend didn't exist. She typed fast, "Got a story for you. It's big. Call me." 30 seconds later, her phone rang. "Natalya," Thomas's voice came through the line, sharp and interested. "You don't usually call unless something's about to explode." Natalya didn't waste time. "They're rigging promotions at SkyWest Atlantic. They're shifting the criteria just as more black pilots, more women are reaching eligibility. And it's not just the policy, it's the entire culture. The way we're treated before we even walk through the door." A pause. Then, "I'm listening." She told him everything. The security incident, the boardroom conversation, the way the meeting had moved on as if nothing had happened, the quiet ways the company ensured power stayed exactly where they wanted it. By the time she finished, Thomas's voice was low and serious. "I need documentation, emails, policy drafts, testimonies from other pilots." "You'll get them." A deep breath on the other end. "Once this drops, there's no going back, Natalya." She knew that, and she was ready. The next 48 hours were chaos. Jada reached out to other pilots, black, women, people of color, who had their own stories. Some had been told outright that they weren't leadership material. Others had watched less experienced white pilots get promoted over them. A few had even been quietly encouraged to leave the airline for better opportunities elsewhere. They gathered emails, internal memos, recordings from training sessions where unconscious bias was barely disguised as company culture. Then, Thomas did what he did best. The article went live at 7 a.m. The headline hit like a lightning strike. "Scaling classes, glass ceiling. How the airline keeps black pilots grounded." It spread fast. News outlets picked it up within hours. Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, everyone was talking about it. Former employees came forward. Customers called out the company. Pilots from other airlines confirmed that this wasn't just SkyWest, it was the industry as a whole. By noon, SkyWest Atlantic's official page was flooded with demands for answers. At first, the company tried damage control, a carefully crafted statement about commitment to diversity and ongoing internal reviews. It wasn't enough. By the afternoon, investors were pulling back. SkyWest's stock was plummeting. Major business partners were reconsidering contracts. Then the biggest blow came. The FAA announced an investigation. Natalya sat in her apartment, watching the news unfold on her laptop, Jada on the other end of the video call. "You seeing this?" Jada grinned. Natalya nodded, exhaling. "They can't ignore it now." Jada leaned back, shaking her head in disbelief. "They thought they could erase us. But they don't get it. They don't get that we were never the problem." Natalya looked at the screen, at the company scrambling to fix something that couldn't be fixed with press releases and corporate jargon. For the first time in a long time, she felt something settle inside her. She had spent years believing she had to play by the rules, that if she just worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, she could prove herself. But the rules were never fair, and she was done asking for a seat at a table that was never meant for her. 3 months later, SkyWest Atlantic filed for bankruptcy. By then, Natalya and Jada had already moved on. They had built something new. A coalition, a program, an entire network for black pilots, for women in aviation, for anyone who had been told they didn't belong. They partnered with airlines that actually wanted change, secured scholarships for young pilots, and started mentoring programs. They weren't just breaking barriers. They were making sure no one else had to break them again. On a bright afternoon, Natalya stood on the tarmac of a small airfield, watching a group of young pilots climb into a simulator, their eyes wide with excitement. Jada walked up beside her, hands on her hips. "Think we did it?" Natalya smiled. "We're just getting started."